Welcome classic rock fans to another one of my worst to best videos, and today I'm going to do Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull are one of my favourite bands of all time. I will preface this video, as I always do, by stressing that these are my own personal choices and rankings. I'd certainly be interested in what yours are. Also, there's quite a lot of albums to get through, so I will probably be fairly brief with the few at the bottom of the list. I will also probably do this over 2 or 3 days, so I apologise for any consistency errors in advance. So at the bottom of the pile, number 20 for me is jtull.com or jethrotull.com from 1990. To me, it's fairly uninspired and uninspiring stuff. I sometimes wonder whether Ian Anderson kept all his best material from that time for his solo album that was due out shortly thereafter, The Secret Life of Birds. I think Spiral is a strong number, and I think there's some wonderful sort of guitar parts by Martin on this record. Some cynics have suggested, of course, that this album is nothing more than an advertisement for the band's new website. Interestingly, I saw them on this tour. I still have the programme, which I managed to get signed after the gig. So there you are. Number 20 is jethrotull.com. And number 19 is Rock Island from 1989. It's an album that follows Crest of a Nave, of course, but is certainly not as good. Kissing Willie is a dreadful track in my opinion, but this album does have some redeeming features. Whalers Dues is a great number. And I like this sort of very Tull-esque concerns with sort of mandolins and sort of some very shady women. Strange Avenues is great with its very nostalgic nod to Aqualung. But overall, I think the album feels like an exercise in mediocrity in many respects. If I remember correctly, Tull played 2 or 3 nights at the Hammersmith Odeon on that tour. I saw them on 2 of those nights. Second night, we had front row seats, which was absolutely fantastic. Now, in those days, of course, the Jethro Tull programme was a worthy purchase. They're absolutely fantastic, with lots of insight and notes and writings from Ian Anderson. When tour programmes are actually genuinely worth buying, I think. So anyway, number 19 is Rock Island. Number 18 is Roots to Branches from 1995, with its Arabian-flavoured flourishes. My word, you try saying that. I specifically like the song Rare and Precious Chain. I think that's a standout track on this record. And although this album does have, as I said, a kind of an Arabic sort of Eastern flavour to it, which certainly determines the mood of this record, I think at times the band seemed to try to reconnect with their earlier jazzy influences as well. I also saw them on this tour. I saw them at the Newcastle City Hall. Why I didn't buy a programme, I don't know, but my presiding memory from that gig is Tull playing We Used to Know. Number 17 is Under Wraps from 1984. Sort of horrible synths combined with sort of programmed drumming kind of define this one for me. Although it's an album that has gained a lot in reputation amongst some Tull fans, unfortunately I'm just not one of them. Although it's saying that it does have some great songs on it. I think European Legacy, which is very much an acoustic number, although it's rather spoilt by the intrusive drumming, I think. Under Wraps 1 is a great melody, although it's still very synth driven, and of course Under Wraps 2, which is a lovely sort of acoustic reprise of the first, is certainly worth listening to. Progsphere.com says of this album, and I'm quoting, "The album is a monotonous bore that soon blends into one endless hellish blur of pounding drums and toneless mumbling, with the occasional flute lead trying fruitlessly to add some life to the music." It's a bit harsh, but I do think they have a point. I think on this album, Ian Anderson also lets go of that rather folky Old English facade as he becomes rather preoccupied with Cold War espionage. Of course, this album for me is a little bit of a valediction in some respects, because it's the last album where Ian Anderson really was vocally on top form. The tour, of course, for this album, he strained his voice far too much. I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, that he had a terrible dose of laryngitis and he didn't rest his voice sufficiently. The result was he did permanent damage, which is why, of course, the following album, Crest of a Nave, is recorded vocally at a much lower key, making him sound very much like Mark Knopfler. Number 16 is Too Old to Rock and Roll from 1976, the album that many critics saw as kind of Jethro Tull's response to punk, with a front cover depicting Ian Anderson very much in sort of fighting, defiant form. It's an album of sort of very tightly, sort of nicely arranged sort of pop sort of rock numbers, very sort of reminiscent of the Warchild album in some respects, although I don't think the writing is quite as good on this album as it was on Warchild. It wasn't a complete disaster chart-wise, even though the critics savaged it, I think. This obviously is the first album John Glasscock plays on, which is interesting, I think. Many critics said that they found the concept a little bit baffling, But the whole album was supposed to accompany a never-produced stage production, a stage production that revolved around the life of Ray Lomas, a biker who ultimately tries to commit suicide, drifts into a coma, only to awake to find the world, everything that he likes, is kind of back into fashion again. Maybe wishful thinking from the part of Ian Anderson, perhaps. Undoubtedly, there are some lovely moments on this album. If I may refer to my notes, the sound, the Jethro Tull sound is definitely apparent, sort of the folk-driven melodies, flute flourishes, some vibrant bass lines. One has to doff their cap to John Glasscock on this one, not to mention some excellent guitar work by Martin Barre. But for me, as I've said, I don't think the songwriting is quite up to sort of Warchild or Minstrel. Conceptually, I don't think it's anywhere near as strong as A Passion Play or Thick as a Brick. Number 15 is This Was from 1968, Tull's debut album, of course. This Was, for me, is an album that only kind of hints at the band that Jethro Tull would evolve into. It lacks that very English idiosyncrasy, which very much comes to define the albums that follow it. In many respects, I always considered the Stand-Up album to be the very first Jethro Tull album, in a manner of speaking. Nevertheless, this is an album obviously that's defined by a hard sort of blues aesthetic, no doubt bossed by guitarist Mick Abrams. Nevertheless, that sort of distinctive Jethro Tull sound is there, from the wonderful sort of flute flourishes and the very distinctive vocals, of course. For me, standout tracks on this album is Serenade, Roland Kirk's Serenade to a Cuckoo, which apparently is the first song Ian Anderson learned to play on the flute, and Song for Jeffrey. I mean, for me, Song for Jeffrey is absolutely remarkable. It kind of signposts that artsy experimentation that the band would embark on with Anderson at the helm. But for me, Song for Jeffrey is a wonderful example of sort of psychedelic blues. So for me, number 15 is Jethro Tull's debut album, This Was from 1968. Number 14 is Catfish Rising from 1991. Unfortunately, this album often tends to get overlooked. It's kind of lumped in as just another 90s/80s Jethro Tull album. But what's interesting is they move away from those sort of metallic meanderings we got with Crest of a Nave and Rock Island. And instead we get a kind of a much rawer, sort of bluesier sound. The melodies on this album are distinctive and memorable. There's some excellent flute work from Ian Anderson. And the soloing from Martin Barre, it's not as flamboyant as the previous album, but nevertheless it's profoundly beautiful and effective, especially on, for example, Still Loving You Tonight is a great example of that. Also, this is an album which, if I'm not mistaken, sees Andrew Giddings join the band for the first time. So that's kind of a debut for him. Nevertheless, like all good Jethro Tull albums, there are still some rather eclectic influences on there. For example, Like a Tall Thin Girl still has a very Indian sort of themed vibe to it, kind of reminiscent of the Roots to Branches album. And Rocks on the Road is kind of reminiscent of an older Tull song, really, but it's certainly quite quirky and a welcome addition to the set list. Standout tracks on this album, apart from the ones I've already mentioned, Tall Thin Girl, of course, Rocks on the Road I've already mentioned. A Sparrow on the Schoolyard Wall is an excellent listen, I think. Anyway, so number 14 is Catfish Rising. And number 13 is A from 1980. Certainly by the time the band entered the sort of 1980s, all those sort of Tullish traits were gone in many respects. In fact, as one critic has pointed out, the recurring figure of the vagabond sage, as well as the historical immersion of their music with Dickensian and Elizabethan sensibilities, were all gone. Of course, famously, the A is for Anderson. This was supposed to be a solo album. Ian Anderson wanted to experiment with sort of new musical technology on a solo release. It was actually pressure from Chrysalis, of course, that made him release it under the Jethro Tull moniker. But it was certainly a departure from what we kind of expected from Jethro Tull. As Ultimate Classic Rock has pointed out, and I'm quoting, "Its futuristic cover art, swapping Robin Hood garb for laboratory coats, natural landscapes for the Starship Enterprise, incited instant prejudice amongst long-time Tull fans." But certainly not this one. I loved a lot of aspects on this album. I really enjoyed Filing Their Flyer. I loved the video for it as well. I saw Black Sunday live was absolutely immense. And I really, really enjoyed the song Working John, Working Joe, which of course existed in demo form as way back as 1976. But I think for many, the real axe to grind with this album is it was a departure from that classic lineup. Of course, that classic lineup that brought us that remarkable trilogy of albums, Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses, and of course Stormwatch. But there were personal reasons why some of those members left. Of course, Barrymore Barlow left as he was fundamentally depressed, I think, after the death of John Glasscock. And as Dave Rees said in his book, Minstrels in the Gallery, History of Jethro Tull, published in 2001, he says that Anderson never intended to replace Jethro Tull's previous lineup with the musicians who recorded A, but was forced by Chrysalis Records, which had decided to release his solo album under the name Jethro Tull. So we kind of had a new lineup of Jethro Tull rather foisted upon us, it seems. In many respects, I think A is a very reflective album. It does lack that those sort of hard rock punches that we get with that punctuate sort of classic Tull albums, but it certainly does contain some quality tunage. Certainly Eddie Jobson's arrangements on this album are certainly leaner and more muscular than we'd usually get with David Palmer. David Palmer's had a kind of a luxuriating in front of a log fire on a chilly December morning sort of vibe to them. So with Eddie Jobson, they're more sort of stripped down, hard sort of folk rock augmented by synthesizers and of course his wonderful sort of electric violin. As I've said, I really like this album, and I certainly hope when it comes to the Stephen Wilson sort of book sort of package that we will get, I suppose, in the next couple of years, I'm hoping we get a fully restored version of the Slipstream concert, plus other concerts from this time, as well as sort of TV performances. But we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? Number 12 is Minstrel in the Gallery from 1975. Now, I know some of you might be appalled at the fact that it seems to have got quite a relatively low ranking, but that's simply due to the fact that a testimony to the awesomeness of the albums that are stacked above it. The recording of this very low-key sort of introspective album took place, I think, mainly in France on the French Riviera. The band decamped out that way probably to avoid tax, I suspect. But it surprises me, really, considering the rather harrowing experiences they had at the Chateau d'Hérouville whilst trying to record a passion play. It's certainly an interesting album, from its Joseph Nash painting front cover, of course, to the intricacies of the string arrangements. It seemed almost a million miles from the almost sort of conceptual bombast we got with Thick as a Brick and Passion Play, the very rocky, radio-friendly sounding Warchild album. But that's the thing with Jethro Tull. I mean, they were so eclectic they could just switch to being almost a completely different band from album to album, which is very much a testimony to Ian Anderson's genius, I guess. Nevertheless, Rolling Stone magazine were not particularly taken with this album. In fact, they described it as, if I may quote, they described this album as Jethro Tull's Elizabethan boogie, which signifies little and delivers less. Nevertheless, Martin Barr insists that Ian Anderson was on top form when it came to writing songs during this period, and when you listen to this album, it's hard to disagree with him. Not a lot of this album was actually performed live on the subsequent tour, probably due to the fact they felt that the very intricate and delicate nature of the material did not translate well to the big auditoriums Tull were playing at the time. Also the fact that a lot of the material was recorded using open tuning, which made performing them live a tad tricky, I guess. Nevertheless, they did often perform the title track Minstrel in the Gallery, which is certainly one of the highlights of this album. There's certainly no doubt that Ian Anderson draws a lot of inspiration from some traditional English sort of folk elements, but there are some very sort of harsh, abrasive moments on it as well, which rattle your fillings, especially Martin Barr's fantastic guitar parts in the title track, which in many ways for me recalls the tautness and the aggression that we got with the Aqualung album. As I've said, the title track for me is one of the stand-up moments, as it blends sort of folk elements with some punctuated with some wonderful sort of flute lines. It's kind of like contrived to recreate a kind of archaic pre-Elizabethan feel, blended with sort of the harshness of contemporary rock. It's absolutely awesome. Certainly Cold Winter Valhalla displays Anderson's flair for melody, and not to mention the very beautiful sort of intimate Requiem, which is just Ian Anderson on his own with an acoustic guitar. Baker Street Muse is also an interesting one, as it kind of recalls some would say the prog excesses of Tull's early 70s stuff, but coming in at 17 minutes, it's certainly a tad more manageable than its conceptual predecessors. Number 11 is Broadsword and the Beast from 1982. A wonderful album, a wonderful blend of sort of folk sort of elements mixed with these kind of electronic soundscapes. Of course, Ian Anderson was particularly interested in sort of employing sort of new technology in the music Jethro Tull were making at the time, certainly from the A album onwards. Whereas I felt he kind of overdid it with, by the time we get to Under Wraps, on this album it works perfectly, I think. It's a wonderfully sort of atmospheric album, and let's not forget the absolutely stunning artwork by Ian McCaig. So for me, Broadsword and the Beast operates perfectly within the paradigms of what I consider as the archetypal Jethro Tull album. It blends those sort of folky aesthetics with Ian Anson's interest in more sort of electronic sort of forays and new music, so to speak. It's a fine and cohesive work, and the track Broadsword, which is the standout moment on this album for me, is not only fantastically atmospheric, but it's almost cinematic in its scope. There are other tracks on this album which are quintessentially Jethro Tull. Slow Marching Band is a triumph, and Pussy Willow, of course, which is great as well. Certainly with this album, if you were to strip away those sort of 1980s affectations, it would very much sound like the sort of album Jethro Tull would have produced in the late 70s. For me, the electronic touches are unassuming. In fact, in many ways, they serve to complement beautifully the other sort of instrumental sort of aspects of this record. Number 10 is Stormwatch from 1979. No doubt a great album, but I think it fails to live up to the brilliance of its predecessors in many respects. You get that enchanting sort of English sort of folklore that's explored on Songs from the Wood, and the rather grounded in reality look at country life that we get with Heavy Horses. This album in many respects is slightly darker than those. But certainly this album ends that kind of Jethro Tull trilogy, those 3 albums really. It's very doleful songs of nostalgia and longing that sort of characterise this album. In many respects, it's quite a dark and brooding album, which is certainly hinted at by the rather menacing cover art. Certainly the instrumentation is absolutely first class on this record. It's certainly a big nod has to go to some absolutely superb drumming by Barrymore Barlow and David Palmer, who is the hero of this period in terms of Jethro Tull as far as I'm concerned. If you look at the wonderful trilogy of albums that Jethro Tull produced at this time, you get Songs from the Wood that looks at this very mythological and distant past. Then you get Heavy Horses, which focuses very much on a receding past in many respects. And then you get Stormwatch, which focuses our attention on a very threatening near future. I mean, even the title Stormwatch has a menace to it. And certainly with tracks like North Sea Oil and Dark Ages, it's an album that focuses fundamentally on the environmental and economic consequences of the modern age. Certainly some tracks on this album is absolute classic Tull fare. Old Ghosts is one of my favourite songs of this album. You get Dark Ages is absolutely epic, dark and brooding, and the soundscaping is absolutely perfect. I love the live version on Bursting Out as well. And also Dunringill, which is just absolutely beautiful. I love the fact that they pulled this one out for the Crest of a Nave tour as well. An absolutely stunning album which marks a period, which marks an end to that sort of classic lineup before we get this seismic shift that would be the A album. Number 9 is Warchild from 1974. I love the way this album starts with the siren. It reminds me of Black Sabbath's War Pigs, but obviously without the coke and the menace. Instead we get the lovely jangle of a cup of tea and the crisp snap of a morning newspaper. I love the way Anderson makes that analogy between everyday life and commerce and warfare. This album in many respects was born of an aborted plan really to make it a film called A Warchild, a musical fantasy, which would have seen our protagonist delve the fiery nether regions, very much like Alice in Wonderland meets Dante. Certainly these hellscapes seem to be a recurring motif for Ian Anderson. We already had that with a passion play with Ronnie Pilgrim journeying from the Fulham Road all the way to the fiery abyss. Instead, after the project was abandoned due to probably lack of funding and lack of interest, we returned to more conventional song structures, songs that are full of wit and charm. Of course, some of the material on this album is excavated from those ill-fated Chateau d'Araville sessions. Two Fingers, of course, is a more gentle, less acidic reworking of a track called Lick Your Fingers Clean, which was actually spawned during the Aqualung sessions. This album returns to sort of a very traditional sort of Tull fare in many respects. It's a return to those sort of shorter, more sort of folk blues influenced numbers. I mean, standout tracks, of course, for me are Backdoor Angel, Sea Line, and Skating Away on the Thin Ice of a New Day. What an awesome number that is. But my favourite song on this record, my favourite song is Tomorrow Was Today. Obviously this track has only recently been unearthed and was actually recorded during the sessions for this album. But what a fantastic song that is. It was an album that was certainly positively received by the critics, unlike A Passion Play, which was absolutely mauled. In fact, Steve Peacock of Sounds gave it an absolutely thoroughly positive endorsement. And certainly Ian Anderson was busy at this time. I think he sat in the producer's chair for the Steel Eye Span album, Now We Are Six. He even got David Bowie to play saxophone on it. But without doubt, this is a great album. And a great tour, of course, which saw Ian Anderson adorn that kind of very medieval-style garb. Not to mention that very tidy packet preserver in the form of a very ornate codpiece. Definitely number 9 has to be Warchild for me. Number 8 for me is Crest of a Nave from 1987. Jethro Tull's heavy metal album, of course, their Grammy-winning album. It's an interesting record, actually. I first remember hearing Steel Monkey on the Tommy Vance Friday Rock show, if you remember him. It did sound very ZZ Top-ish, but the whole of the album, of course, has a slightly different sound to it, especially after the Under Wraps record. It's a massive contrast from that one. But of course, Ian Anderson's vocal issues meant that everything was recorded has a slightly lower sort of timbre, raspy sort of quality to his voice. And combined with the very clear and crisp guitar sound of Martin Barr, Jethro Tull were accused of trying to sound like Dire Straits, trying to muscle in on the success of Brothers in Arms, so to speak. And it's certainly true that Anderson's voice had changed on this record, but the quality of his voice was all about character and expression rather than range. Mind you, that didn't stop him opening with this tour. The opening number was Songs from the Wood. This is a very important album for me. One that has a lot of emotional resonance, shall we say. Some of you may balk at the idea of me putting this higher than Broadsword and the Beast, even higher than Minstrel in the Gallery and Warchild, but it's an album that I'm incredibly fond of. It was actually the first CD I ever bought as well. But Ian Anderson has gone on record to saying that Budapest is the quintessential Jethro Tull song, and he's not far wrong. It's absolutely stunning. The guitar work on it is crisp and delicate, and as well as being absolutely beautiful as well, combined with the wonderful sort of flute lines and the interesting signature changes, all complemented by Anderson's very sort of husky vocals, which seem to thematically suit the song, I think. Also, Farm on the Freeway. I mean, when we get that opening bit that finishes, and then the powerful drums and electric guitar come into it, it's a real spine-tingling moment for me. And this was the first time I ever saw Jethro Tull as well. I saw them on this tour, and the wonderful cover art spawned a fantastic T-shirt, as well as an absolutely stunning tour programme. This tour programme, in fact, which I've kept lovingly all these years. And I even kept my ticket for the event as well. It's live at the Birmingham NEC. I remember getting the train back to Euston Station and having to sleep the night on the station. I'm too long in the tooth for those sort of shenanigans these days, but a great album, number 8, Crest of a Nave. Number 7 is Benefit from 1970. I think this album suffers a little bit by being sandwiched between the innovative Stand Up and, of course, the career-defining Aqualung. In fact, Classic Rock has gone on to describe this album as it's the sound of a band finding its future. Certainly, you know, there's that wonderful blend of electro and sort of acoustic sort of interplay with songs like Sun and With You There to Help Me. Brilliant guitar work from Martin Barr and some quality riffing as well. That wonderful riff on the on Teacher, for example. But it's that quintessential Tull sound that is emerging, drawn from the paradigms of folk and other sort of eclectic influences. Thankfully, they'd sort of moved away from that sort of hybrid blues fusion that very much defines their very earliest album, of course. Certainly a lot of the songs on the Benefit album display a lot of folk-like melodies in many respects. Very downbeat, but Ian Anderson's lyrics are quite profound and complex. It's, as I've said, it's certainly one of those sort of bookmark albums that made us take notice. And my word, I mean, what came next? It was certainly earth-shattering in terms of Jethro Tull. Interestingly, of course, John Evans actually guests as a musician on this album before he becomes a fully signed-up member of the band. Anyway, number 7 is Benefit from 1970. Number 6 is Stand Up from 1969. For me, this is the very first Jethro Tull album in many respects. It's the album where their sound is very much born, then tinkered with for Benefit, before fully emerging on the Aqualung album. There's a real sense of experimentation on this record. It's really an eclectic mix, a kind of an experimentation of musical form. But it's certainly an album that put the band at odds with John Peel, who was an early champion when they first started. I think he felt that they'd not only betrayed him, but their sound, that sense of authenticity that he felt they had. Although, personally, I don't think there's anything authentic about British bands playing blues, but that's just my opinion, of course. This album for me bristles with vitality, energy, wonderful compositions like Fat Man, which sees the band flirting with sort of sitars and sort of Indian motifs. I mean, what an ambitious record this was. And on this album, a lot of eclectic sort of influences rise to the fore. A lot of the tracks on this album are very much inspired by the work of Bert Jansch and Roy Harper, of course, as well as sort of classical flourishes and the very jazzy rendition of Boré. This album is a very precocious record and has a maturity, considering it's only their second album. And of course it's Martin Barre's debut album, and how stunning he is on this record, really sort of cementing his place in the band after replacing a couple of itinerant guitar players, namely Tony Iommi and Davio List from The Nice. Of course, Martin Barre joins just in time before the band's European tour, where they actually supported Jimi Hendrix. Of course, this album features one of my favourite Tull numbers, which is We Used to Know. Now, interestingly, of course, Jethro Tull was supported by the Eagles in 1972, and I think it's Ian Anderson or Martin Barre, I'm not sure, convinced that the Eagles were influenced or perhaps stole the chord progression from this song for their classic Hotel California. I'm not sure that it's true, really, to be honest with you, as the music to Hotel California, the chords and the guitar work was all written by Don Felder, and Don Felder didn't join the Eagles until 1974. Anyway, number 6 on my Tull list is the wonderful Stand-Up from 1969. Number 5 is Heavy Horses from 1978, an album that follows hard upon the Songs from the Wood album and ploughs sort of familiar ground, if you excuse the agricultural metaphor. The first track recorded on this album was actually Heavy Horses, when Ian Anderson had a dreadful cold. So the double-tracked vocals probably cover a multitude of sins in this case. Certainly one has to doff their cap to the genius that is David, now D. Palmer, whose arrangements on this album are absolutely stunning, from No Lullaby to Moths, of course. And for those of us who are really attentive and listen to it, The Mouse Please Never Sleeps, David Palmer incorporates a fugue exposition based on the tune of Three Blind Mice. What I love about this album is it continues very much in the vein of Songs from the Wood, but gone is the idealism and that exploration of rural myths. Instead, we get a very down-to-earth portrayal of the realities of country life in many respects, or rural existence. It's an album that speaks beautifully and mournfully of sort of impending change. I mean, in fact, the song Heavy Horses feels like a valediction in many ways. It's like a saying goodbye to the old ways, a kind of surrendering to what Thomas Hardy calls the ache of modernism in Tessa the D'Urbervilles. On this album we get sublime melodies and a very brisk and crisp sounding guitars and mandolins. Certainly a call out has to go out to Ian Anderson's production values, as well as the engineering work of Robin Black. Standout track on this album, well, with this album every track is a standout track. One of my favourite songs on this album is Rover, although I don't think they've ever performed this one live. I could be wrong though. Number 4 is Songs from the Wood from 1977, an interesting album where Anderson sort of hangs up all his minstrel garb and assumes the persona of the country squire. If we think about the musical landscape in 1977, very much defined by the sneering defiance of God Save the Queen and Anarchy in the UK, along come Jethro Tull with their exploration of folk tales and myth and English whimsy. This album is a wonderful interplay of sort of English medieval eccentricity, as well as some excellent sort of vocal harmonisations on tracks like Songs from the Wood, of course. Again, as I said previously, a big call-out has to go to David Palmer, who is an absolute genius, I think now D. Palmer, of course. And of course, with this album begins the Tull trilogy, of course, Songs from the Wood, Heavy Horses and Stormwatch. This album is so remarkable it could easily sit atop anyone's ranking list. I love the optimism that exudes from this album, this very mischievous feel as it explores the landscape of woodland sprites and spirits. It has an effervescent quality to it. This is an album that was inspired, of course, by Ian Anderson reading a book published in 1973 called Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain. But this album is very much reeks of kind of a collective endeavour. everybody on board with it. It's not just an Anderson-led project. Even Barrymore Barlow, the quintessential rock drummer, as far as I'm concerned, was experimenting with glockenspiels and marimbas and things like that. It's and that kind of spirit exudes from this record. I really, really enjoy listening to this record. It transports you to another time and place. It's a thoroughly uplifting experience. Number 3 is the Aqualung album from 1971. For many, this is the defining Jethro Tull album. But this album is certainly a stunning sort of progression from those first 3 albums to full-on sort of conceptual constructs that we get on Aqualung. Although Ian Anderson maintains that this is not a concept album, and I figured he would know. Side 1 is specifically interesting for me. I particularly like those CD vignettes of Aqualung and Cross-Eyed Mary, of course, before we drift into sort of the folklore and fabled imagery of Mother Goose. Side 2 seems to very much deal with Anderson's disillusionment with organised religion. I mean, Aqualung, that riff of Aqualung is so iconic. It's certainly up there with the Stones' Satisfaction and the Beatles' Day Tripper. But it's certainly Aqualung that draws our attention, really, the character of Aqualung, that phlegmy old soap dodger that appears on the cover. And of course you get Locomotive Breath, which features on this album, a song that is in Tull's setlist to this day. A brilliant analogy on things spiralling out of control in the image of the thundering locomotive. I love Side 1, as I've said, as it's a series of like character sketches drawn from secular English life before we move into the very gothic script that earmarks the beginning of the more liturgical aspects of Side 2, where the focus of the album becomes more on sort of spiritual matters. This is no doubt a very stunning album where Ian Anderson's songwriting really comes into its fore, very musically ambitious as well. I love Steven Wilson's mix of this album. I always felt that the sound of this album sounded a little bit emaciated. I think Steven Wilson makes it sound fuller and warmer. Number 2 is Thick as a Brick from 1972, the mother of all concept albums. So annoyed was Anderson with people labelling Aqualung as a concept album, he thought he'd give them the ultimate concept album in Thick as a Brick. Now, many people see this album as a kind of a prog parody, and there's certainly elements of that. Ian Anderson has said that a lot of the fiddly bits on Thick as a Brick are supposed to kind of a little bit of an affectionate send-up of Yes and bands like King Crimson, who he felt, although fantastic musicians, took themselves way too seriously. Obviously, the concept of the album is built around a fictional poem written by Milton Bostock, whose adult life is explored on Ian Anderson's Thick as a Brick 2. And there's a combination, a lot of things are going on this album. It's obviously it's lots of complex music incorporated with Ian Anderson's sense of humour as he pokes fun at sort of his contemporaries, musicians and music critics alike. I love the way this album, in true prog vein, fuses sort of jazz and blues elements with sort of classical flourishes as well. Is interesting exploration of time signatures, all combined with Ian Anderson's very sort of stream of consciousness sort of lyrics. We certainly have to doff our cap to Barrymore Barlow, who joins the band for this album, effectively replacing Clive Bunker. His drumming on this record is absolutely stunning. He certainly lifts the whole project up a notch, I think. The band have managed to produce with this prog parody, so to speak, artistically a stunning sort of tour de force, challenging, profound, yet nevertheless still, unlike perhaps some of their contemporaries, still perfectly accessible. It's an album that's certainly not as dense, I think, as the Aqualung album with its very turgid sort of liturgical themes. It's much more light-hearted and frothy in many respects, in a very good way. I mean, this album has to make anyone's top 5 Tull list, especially an album that contains lyrics like, "Let me make you a present of song as the wise man breaks wind and is gone." Wise words indeed. And number 1 is The Passion Play from 1973. Now, Jethro Tull were doing very well after Thick as a Brick. They were playing huge arenas. And I think the ambition or the plan was, or so I heard, was to produce a double album. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But certainly the Chateau d'Ereville recordings, or the Chateau Disaster tapes as they were humorously referred to by Ian Anderson on the 20th anniversary box set. I love the recordings on that box set, the reverb that's been added to Anderson's voice. It gives it an enigmatic quality. But I also love the very stark and honest rendering of those tapes by Stephen Wilson, very much in keeping with the production values of the early 70s. This is a wonderful album. Of course, the recordings actually began at the Chateau d'Hérouville, of course, in France. They decamped that way, probably to avoid tax perhaps, but also to record somewhere prestigious where Pink Floyd had recorded Obscured by Clouds. Elton John had recorded his Honky Chateau album. But it was recording sessions beset with disasters, as well as punctuated by bouts of food poisoning, effectively putting the chat in chateau. But I love the concept of this album, this whole motif of these hellscapes that Anderson seems to be somewhat preoccupied with, as am I, to be honest with you. It's very tongue-in-cheek, of course. It's not quite Paradise Lost or The Divine Comedy, as we explore the journey made by Ronnie Pilgrim from the Fulham Road to the fiery abyss. Even the name, of course, Ronnie Pilgrim, is a polite nod to John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress. For me, this is an absolutely stunning album in terms of its scope and its ambition. Many Jethro Tull fans view this as a divisive album. It's kind of Jethro Tull's topographic oceans, if you like. But I love the theatrical conceit that is explored on this album. The album is broken up into acts even. And of course, we've got that wonderful theatrical programme that came with the original vinyl release. Of course, the Passion Play, of course, was a medieval construct that very much dealt with the life, death and passion of Jesus Christ, whereas Ian Anson deals with the life and death of Ronnie Pilgrim as he journeys from the Fulham Road to the foot of the stairs, that analogy for the fiery nether regions. Of course, Ronnie Pilgrim descends into hell, deciding he just wants to see what it's like after viewing his life in the memory bank. I can understand why a lot of people don't like this album. It's incredibly dense, challenging listen. But for me, combine this album with all those Chateau d'Hérouville recordings and it's an absolute delight to listen to from beginning to end. So for me, the quintessential best Jethro Tull album ever is 1973's A Passion Play. And if you have a moment, I would urge you to check out my classic album review, which I did on this very album. I will post the link below. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this exploration of Jethro Tull's back catalogue. Thank you for watching. Please click like and subscribe, share this video, check out the Facebook page, but more importantly, please do keep listening.